Ancient Rome didn't conquer the world by chance. It did it through discipline, blood, and sweat. At the heart of the Roman Empire was a machine not made of gears but of men, the Roman legions. Trained with relentless rigor, they marched thousands of kilometers, crossing deserts, mountains, forests, returning alive or dying in battle, never breaking formation. But how did Rome forge soldiers so feared, so loyal, and so effective? In this video, you'll discover how an ordinary citizen was transformed into a legionary, from the first steps of recruitment to the sacred oath that sealed their loyalty to the empire. From citizen to soldier in the early centuries of the Republic, the Roman army operated more like a militia of ordinary citizens than a professional military force. Military service was a civic duty expected of every free Roman man. However, answering this call to arms came at a personal cost. Men had to abandon their farms, shops, and families to take up weapons. They were not paid for their service, and each soldier had to purchase his own weapons and armor. The army disbanded when the conflict ended, and the soldiers simply returned home to resume their lives. This system was functional only when Rome was still a relatively small city-state, but as Rome expanded its influence, annexing provinces, quelling rebellions, and defending far-flung borders, it became increasingly clear that a part-time military could not meet the demands of a growing empire. To ensure its security and continued dominance, Rome required a permanent army, a professional fighting force that was always ready, disciplined, and adequately compensated. This shift began in the waning days of the Republic and was fully realized under Augustus, the first emperor. Augustus introduced formal salaries for soldiers, bonuses for campaigns, and promises of land upon retirement. These incentives made military service an attractive and stable career, particularly for those from lower economic classes. With this professionalization came a shift in allegiance. Soldiers no longer viewed themselves as defenders of the Senate or the city of Rome itself. Their loyalty gradually transferred to the commanders who led them in the field, the generals who earned their respect and distributed their rewards. This evolution gave rise to the Roman professional army, a standing force that did not just fight wars but was molded to live for them. The Roman legion. To manage this powerful institution, Rome developed a military structure of astonishing precision and efficiency, a system so effective that it remains a subject of study in modern military academies. Each legion, composed of approximately 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers, was divided into 10 cohorts. These cohorts were further broken down into maniples and then centuries, each led by seasoned officers capable of executing commands rapidly and effectively during the chaos of battle. This intricate hierarchy allowed the legion to function like a living organism. Every unit was trained to move in harmony with the others, adapting fluidly to battlefield conditions. Soldiers learned to anticipate commands and act in perfect unison, which gave the Roman legions a level of battlefield coordination rarely matched in antiquity. The scale of Rome's military operations during the empire was immense. At its height, over 150,000 legionaries and another 180,000 auxiliary troops were deployed across a sprawling frontier that stretched more than 10,000 kilometers. From the windswept moors of northern Britannia to the scorched dunes of the Sahara, from the shadowy forests of Germania to the rugged heights of Syria, the legions stood watch. Supporting this massive military presence required a robust logistical system. Rome addressed this through a vast and meticulously maintained network of roads, fortified supply lines, permanent military depots, and an administrative infrastructure staffed by specialized officers. This system allowed the empire to project power with astonishing speed. A single command issued from the capital could travel across continents and be executed with unwavering precision. Recruitment. Before a man could become a soldier in this formidable machine, he first had to pass a demanding selection process. Even before touching a weapon or wearing armor, potential recruits were scrutinized in a procedure that was as strict as the training itself. The process was overseen by officers known as conquistadores. These recruiters traveled from town to town and village to village, seeking out promising candidates between the ages of 18 and 23. But youth alone was not enough. The conquistadores assessed every aspect of a candidate's life. Physical fitness was paramount, but family background, profession, literacy and even behavior were weighed carefully. Only freeborn men were permitted to serve in the legions. Slaves and criminals were excluded from enlistment, unless the empire faced an extraordinary crisis and made exceptions out of desperation. In contrast, auxiliary troops, non-citizen forces drawn from the provinces, followed slightly different guidelines, but still underwent rigorous evaluation. Recruits with specialized skills were especially prized. Blacksmiths, carpenters, shoemakers, tailors, anyone with a trade useful to sustaining an army might be directed into logistical and support roles. Those who were literate had the opportunity to serve in clerical or administrative positions, and men from influential families had a higher chance of ascending through the military ranks into leadership roles. Upon acceptance, the new recruit received a metal identification plate, functionally similar to today's dog tags. Losing it was a serious offense that carried heavy consequences. It was more than a tag. It was a symbol of identity, duty and belonging. From that moment on, the young man ceased to be a civilian. He was bound by a new set of laws that dictated not only his actions but his thoughts, values and expectations. Training. The transformation into a Roman legionary began not with weapons but with endurance. Before he was taught to kill, the recruit was taught to suffer. The first 4 months were brutal. Recruits underwent grueling marches while burdened with roughly 20 kilograms of equipment. They began by covering 30 kilometers in 5 hours at a steady pace. As training intensified, this increased to 35 kilometers in the same time, but now at a faster pace. These marches took place under any and all conditions: blazing heat, torrential rain, biting cold, choking dust. Complaints were not tolerated. The march was a fundamental ritual of Roman military life, shaping both body and mind. Physical training didn't end there. Recruits were subjected to an intense regimen of running, swimming, climbing, leaping and other activities designed to build strength, endurance, and resilience. Instructors were merciless. They weren't just conditioning muscles, they were tempering willpower. The goal was to forge bodies that could sleep on bare earth, go long hours without food, carry burdens over long distances, and still be capable of charging into combat without hesitation. The toll was high. Some recruits gave up, others fainted or collapsed under the strain. A few never recovered. Rome had no use for weak men. The ideal soldier wasn't simply someone who could survive a battle. He had to be someone who arrived at the battlefield ready to fight after days of suffering, someone who could still stand tall, shield in hand, when the enemy appeared on the horizon. Because for the Roman legionary, the real battle didn't begin when swords clashed. The battlefield was the final test, one that came only after the trials of marching. Hunger, cold and exhaustion had already pushed the soldier to his limit. Combat. When the body had been hardened by relentless discipline, the recruit was finally taught how to fight. But even this was done with calculated strategy. Legionaries trained using wooden versions of their weapons, particularly the gladius, the short Roman sword. These wooden gladius were deliberately made to be twice as heavy as their real counterparts. The logic was simple: if a soldier could master the heavier version during training, then the real weapon would feel lighter, faster, and more lethal in actual combat. Training drills involved repeated slashing, thrusting and blocking, often against stationary targets or moving dummies. These sessions were always performed in full armor, turning every movement into a trial of strength, coordination and precision. The goal wasn't simply to teach technique, but to turn that technique into instinct. But it wasn't just about technique. Combat demanded mental mastery as much as physical skill. The core aim of training was to turn combat reactions into instinct, actions performed without hesitation or conscious thought. In the chaos of battle, where life and death were determined in seconds, there was no time to think, no room for doubt. A delayed strike or a missed block could mean the end. In addition to mastering the gladius, Roman recruits were trained extensively with the pilum, a heavy javelin uniquely designed for Roman warfare. Its long iron shaft was crafted to bend upon impact, making it useless to the enemy once thrown. This was not just a tactical advantage, it was a psychological one, denying the enemy the chance to reuse the Romans' own weapons. Recruits practiced launching the pilum with precise timing, releasing it in unison during an advance, maximizing its impact, and disrupting enemy formations just before close combat began. Combat training also included the armatura, an intense and often brutal form of sparring. Unlike simple drills, these simulations used real weapons under the watchful eye of seasoned instructors, many of whom were veterans of multiple campaigns. These men had first-hand experience of the battlefield and were paid twice the standard wage, a recognition of the vital role they played in preparing the next generation of legionaries. Under their guidance, soldiers learned to strike with intention, defend with efficiency, and never expose their flanks. Each blow repeated in training was intended to become part of the soldier's muscle memory. Every deflection of a strike, every counter-thrust, was another layer of instinct being forged. This wasn't just repetition for its own sake, it was a matter of life and death. A single mistake in training could mean failure in battle, yet mistakes did happen, and when they did, the Roman system responded with merciless precision. Punishment in the Roman legions was not arbitrary, it was foundational. Discipline was the pillar on which the entire army stood. The success of every maneuver, the survival of every cohort, relied on the absolute obedience of its soldiers. Orders had to be followed without question, and even the smallest infractions were treated with gravity. Without discipline, an army of thousands could become a panicked mob in a matter of moments. Maintaining this iron discipline was the responsibility of the centurion, a commander typically in charge of around 80 men. The centurion was both a leader and an enforcer. His presence was constant, his gaze unyielding. In his hand he carried a vine staff, a traditional symbol of his authority, and he was known to use it liberally. Any soldier who dared break formation, show disrespect, or fail in duty could expect swift punishment. The consequences of disobedience varied depending on the severity of the offense. Falling asleep during guard duty, an act that could put an entire camp at risk, resulted in a public beating to serve as a warning to others. Stealing from fellow soldiers or from the army's supplies might lead to imprisonment, rations being withheld, or public humiliation. Cowardice in the face of the enemy, a betrayal of the most sacred trust, led to a trial before a military tribunal, with punishments ranging from demotion to execution. However, when a transgression endangered or disgraced an entire unit, Rome turned to its most feared form of discipline, decimation. In this grim procedure, 1 in every 10 men from the offending group was selected by lot and then executed, usually beaten or stoned to death by their own comrades. It was an act of collective punishment and psychological warfare designed to erase disobedience through fear. The mere threat of decimation was often enough to keep entire formations in line. One of the most well-known instances of decimation took place under Julius Caesar. When a cohort withdrew from the battlefield without orders, Caesar, despite being admired for his strategic brilliance and political skill, showed no hesitation. He ordered decimation to restore order, reinforcing the message that discipline was non-negotiable, even under the most respected of generals. To the Romans, fear of the enemy was considered a weakness, but fear of one's own leaders, that they believed was strength. It forged a unity, rooted not in emotion, but in obligation and consequence. An army that feared its commanders more than the opposing force was in Rome's eyes unstoppable. After enduring months of grueling physical trials, relentless drills, and the ever-present weight of discipline, the final step in a recruit's transformation was symbolic, yet deeply binding. He was no longer a boy from the countryside or a craftsman from the city. He was on the verge of becoming a Roman legionary. That transition was sealed through the sacramentum, the solemn oath of allegiance. Originally, this oath was pledged to the Senate and the people of Rome, aligning with the values of the Republic. However, as the Republic gave way to the Empire, the focus of loyalty shifted to the Emperor himself. He was no longer just a political figure, but the living embodiment of Rome's authority, the supreme military leader. Swearing the sacramentum to the emperor was not a gesture, it was an unbreakable vow to follow orders without hesitation, to fight without retreat, and if needed to die in defense of the empire. Breaking this oath was tantamount to betraying Rome and one's fellow soldiers. It was a rejection not only of military duty, but of the identity the army had so carefully forged. The oath was the moment a recruit gave up his past and accepted the reality that his life now belonged to something greater than himself. With this oath came tangible recognition. The newly minted legionary received his military diploma, a bronze tablet engraved with his name, enlistment date, and the entitlements earned through service. This document was a badge of honor and a shield of protection. It confirmed his status as a soldier of Rome, guaranteed his pay, and promised future rewards upon successful completion of his service. These rewards were not insignificant. In addition to a monthly wage, soldiers received bonuses during campaigns and were often granted land upon retirement. For many, especially those from poor families or provincial backgrounds, this represented a path to upward mobility. In certain cases, particularly for auxiliary troops who were not Roman citizens at enlistment, service in the legions offered Roman citizenship not only for themselves but for their families, a prize of immense value. Once he had sworn the oath and received his diploma, the soldier was no longer a free agent. His life, his duty, and even his fate were now inseparably tied to the will of Rome. Final thoughts. Roman military training wasn't just physical preparation. It was a complete transformation of body, mind, and identity. It turned farmers, craftsmen, and shepherds into disciplined war machines, men who could march through blistering heat or bitter cold, go days with minimal food or rest, and still fight with precision and endurance. These were not just warriors, they were instruments of Rome's will. The success of the Roman legions was not built solely on superior weapons or clever tactics. It came from the internal strength of the soldiers who served, from their unyielding discipline, their loyalty to command, and the rigorous system that molded them into elite fighters. That model was so effective that it outlived the empire itself, influencing military thought for centuries. Even today, over 2,000 years later, echoes of Roman training principles are still present in modern military academies. In the end, what held the empire together was not just its roads, its politics, or its wealth. It was the legionary. That anonymous man, hardened by effort, loyal to his oath, and molded by a system that understood that Rome's true power did not come from fleeting glory, but from enduring discipline. If you enjoyed learning what powered the strength of Rome's legions, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and as always, may Mars guide you in battle.